Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
The Smiling Man by Sara Clancy. A scream broke the silence of the house, the jarring sound almost making Lori cut off her fingertip. She sprinted from the kitchen, only half aware that her dropped knife was scattering the piles of sliced vegetables from the cutting board. Blockout curtains had kept their house in a constant state of dusk for the last week. What little light pushed around the edges was too sterile to be daylight. It was the only way she knew for sure that night had fallen, and the streetlight in front of their apartment was doing its thing. In a few quick steps, she crossed the living room and passed by her parents' closed bedroom door.
"Lori?"
"I've got him, Mom. Go back to sleep." She barely spoke louder than a whisper, but it was enough to make her throat ache. Ignoring the twinge of pain, she jogged down the short hallway, passing by the bathroom. 2 small rooms sat at the end of the corridor to complete their apartment. In all, the travel only took her a few seconds, but it was long enough for her little brother to fling himself into the hall. "What's wrong?" Lori asked him. "The Smiling Man. I saw him." Lori shushed him. "Whisper voices, remember? Mom and Dad are sick too." He stomped his little foot. "You're not listening to me." "I'll listen." A dizzy fit hit her as she crouched down before him. "But we need to use our whisper voices, okay?" Riley pouted, but mumbled, "Okay." "Good. Now, we've talked about this. The Smiling Man isn't real. You're just really sick, and it's giving you nightmares." "No, he's real." Riley's whine hit that perfect pitch that made Lori feel like an ice pick was getting jabbed into her skull. "I saw him. I did. He was right across the driveway." "Shh. Please, God, shut up." Sure that her skull was about to crack, she forced a smile. "It's okay." Mercifully, he lowered his voice to a hiss. "I saw him, Lori." "Okay, so let's go check together." Lori liked to think that she was a reasonable, good-natured person, not the kind of individual that would go around hitting a third grader in the face. But as she pulled her trembling brother up into her arms, she decided that Kevin Rudder's pug nose was incredibly punchable. The little mutant's lie about the Smiling Man was pretty much an urban legend at this point, and one of the reasons Lori hadn't been able to get a decent night's sleep in almost a month. With Riley on her hip, Lori rounded the bed and shuffled to the tall, narrow windows that took up the corner of the room. Lori shifted her little brother higher onto her hip before reaching out to pull the curtain back. "Careful," Riley hissed. "He'll see us." "Okay," she whispered. Very slowly she wrapped her fingers around the edge of the heavy material and inched it back. They both ended up craning their necks to see through the gap she was creating. Their particular building was on the far end of the apartment complex. A small patch of tree-lined grass was visible from the balcony off the living room, a view that was also visible from the master bedroom. The 2 kids' rooms, however, overlooked the driveway that separated them from 4 other identical buildings. Streetlights marked each corner, dividing the darkness into patches. High up the sloping driveway, a few decorative bushes swayed in the breeze. A stray fruit bat slipped through the patches of sterile light on its way to the park's trees. Riley looked personally offended that there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. He nearly launched himself out of Lori's arms to plaster himself against the window glass. "He was right there. I saw him." Lori bundled him back into her arms and carried him to the bed. I know you think you did. I'm not crazy, Lori. She winced as the high-pitched whine made a return. I'm going to murder Kevin. I'm not saying you are. Remember what we talked about. She put him on the bed and, after switching on the nightlight, sat down before him. There's a virus going around, and you dingus, just had to go and catch it. And what happens to your brain when you've got the nasty flu? Riley kept his defiant scowl as he mumbled, It gets confused. But I'm not. I saw him. She smiled encouragingly. The smiling man isn't real. But, dingus, she cut in, pushing him gently until he started to shuffle back under the blankets. You're sick. Your brain's getting what you see and what you dream all mixed up. No! Riley kicked viciously at his sheets, and Lori felt her will to live plummet. The motion signified that he wasn't going to let this go until they rehashed the whole thing over again. The smiling man comes after sick kids. He smells it. You do reek. Her joke landed flat, and she pushed a long sigh through her nose. He hunts down the sick kids, and when he gets close enough... Riley leaned forward to whisper, his eyes growing wide. He eats them. How can he eat a whole kid? You guys are kind of big. Riley's brow furrowed. I don't know. Maybe his jaw opens up like a snake, or maybe he just eats a bit of you. Well, that's just wasteful. Lori! He whined. She waved a hand in defeat. Okay, so that's the story, right? Right. And you heard this before you got sick, right? Sensing a trap, he glared at her, the effect somewhat diminished by his constant sniffing. So, if I remember, you were having nightmares about the smiling man before you got sick. Now you're sick, and your brain is all woogie, and you're seeing him. When he didn't respond, she gave up on trying to lead him to the conclusion, and just straight out told him. Your brain's forgotten that he isn't real. Once you're all better, he'll go back to just being a story. He still didn't look convinced, but allowed her to tuck him back in. Besides, she added with a smile, Kevin is the one who told you the story, right? He nodded. Kevin. The kid that keeps licking the monkey bars is the one that found out about this mysterious monster. When did he become a super detective? Finally, she managed to get a small laugh out of her brother. She regretted it a bit when the soft chuckle brought on a ragged coughing fit. Helping Riley take a sip of his water, she stayed until the fit passed, then headed back to the door. Lori? The weak voice made her pause at the door. Yeah, dingus? My brain forgot he wasn't real? Yeah. Riley pulled the blanket up to his chin. What if the smiling man forgets that he's not real, too? Wouldn't that make him real? He's not real, so he can't forget or remember anything. But dreams are real when we dream them. They're part of the dream world. I don't think that's a thing. He looked at her like she was dumb. Yes, it is. Everyone knows that. Oh, the dreams are trapped there because they know they're dreams. So if the smiling man forgets that he's a dream, he'd be able to escape. Then he'll be real. That's not how it works. Even while he cowered, his voice was defiant. Prove me wrong. I should never have taught him that expression. Lori could withstand the month-long quarantine the outbreak had forced them into. She could keep going, taking care of her family, even while her head pounded and her spit was steadily replaced with fire. She could even do it all without complaining once. What she couldn't do was combat third-grade logic in the middle of the night while razor wire wound between her joints. "I'll have a speech ready by breakfast," she said. "Go to sleep. But I'll make sure all the doors are locked." He scowled, and she sighed. "I'll even go down to make sure the communal door is locked. So, unless the smiling man's got the PIN code or a key, he's not getting into the building, let alone our apartment." Riley released a yawn as he curled up under the blankets. "Remember to check the garage entrance, too." "Yes, sir." Closing the door softly, she trudged back down the hallway, her feet suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. A hacking cough made her chest ache and stripped her throat raw. "Put on the kettle, then check the doors." For a second she considered just not following through on her promise. It was a tempting thought, but he'd know. He always knows.
"Lori?"
Her mother croaked from the other side of the master bedroom door. "He's fine, Mom," she said, just loud enough to be heard. "Same nightmare, different night."
"I'm really starting to hate that Kevin boy."
"Way ahead of you." She took the small grunt that came from the room as her father agreeing with them, and then the apartment returned to silence. Lori spared a moment to set the electric kettle to boil and eyed the scattered pile of sliced vegetables with annoyance. There had been plenty of warning about the virus. It had dominated the news cycle for weeks before a case had even hit Australian shores. Being an island nation had lured many people into a false sense of security. The borders were secure, and the quarantine system one of the best in the world. But the virus had snuck in and ripped through the population like wildfire. The panic had been swift, but rather mundane. No rioting in the streets. Instead, everyone just began hoarding, stripping the shelves in a matter of days. Lori was not looking forward to trying to get to the grocery store to replace the vegetables. "I'll just thicken the soup up with some frozen peas." With the dismissive thought, she grabbed her mobile and set of house keys and shoved on some flip-flops. The soft click of the boiling kettle turning itself off followed her into the hall. The single staircase zigzagged up the height of the building, with every second landing servicing 2 apartments. Since it doubled as the fire exit, the whole length of it was made of thick stone that amplified even the slightest trace of sound. Lori was careful, but the heavy door still slammed shut, the loud thud echoing both above her and below. She winced in sympathy. At this point, their building could double as a biohazard quarantine site. If the sound hurt her head that much, she hated to think what the others were going through. The clack of her flip-flops resounded off the walls as she lumbered down the stairs. The minimal exercise had her heart thundering and her lungs straining. She gripped the handrail as sweat soaked her armpits and gathered at the back of her neck. Being stuck inside the tiny apartment for so long had clearly allowed her to overestimate her health. By the time she reached the ground floor, she had worked her irritation into thick resentment. She kicked at the front door. Unsurprisingly, it rattled in the frame, securely locked in place. Well, this was worth the trip. Rolling her eyes left her dizzy, and she slumped against the railing. It took her a moment to collect herself, and just before she started up the staircase, she remembered the second half of her promise. Heaving a sigh, she glared down the last flight of stairs. She didn't want to bother with it, but facing Riley's snotty wrath would be far worse, and she trudged on. Reaching the bottom landing, Lori braced against the wall and heaved a deep breath. Heat pulsated under the neckline of her shirt, to waft against her face in a way that was just irritating. It felt like cement had been poured into her nose and turned to rocks within her sinuses. She couldn't catch her breath. The onslaught of sensation dashed the last of her hope that she might skirt by with only the sniffles. Damn it! She unleashed her frustration against the door. With a loud click, it opened. The heavy door swung back to smack against the wall and lodge into place. Still, she waited for a second to see if it would close on its own. It didn't. Yeah, that seems about right. It was like the tiny bit of exercise had opened the floodgates. She could feel her temperature climbing with every passing second, and all she wanted was to curl up on the couch and binge-watch some reality TV. Shuffling forward, she reached across the threshold and into the brightly lit parking garage, grasping blindly for the door handle. She didn't want to go in there. The glare of the lights against the pure white paint was painful to look at. A dark shape loomed in the corner of her eyes. Lori snapped around to face it so fast that her brain sloshed against the inside of her skull. The blinding white seared into her brain, further deepening the ebony shape so that it seemed superimposed against the far wall. It vanished by the time her eyes fixed directly on it. Lori froze, her hand outstretched and her eyes fixed on the far wall. Suddenly, the silence around her felt unnatural, sitting too thick in the now heavy air. She scanned the empty parking lot, her arm looping in the air a few times before her fingertips found the door handle. The hinges whispered as she pulled the door closed. It was a far cry from a rusted groan, but it made her skin crawl in the same way. The door settled into its frame, with the gentle click of metal against metal as the automatic lock engaged. She stood there for a moment, picking at her fingertips, trying to quell the slow roll of her stomach. Without thought, she snapped her hand out and pushed the door. It held solid, and she breathed a little easier. A few seconds passed as she stared at the door, waiting for the dread in the pit of her stomach to settle. It didn't. What the hell am I doing? The sudden realization hit her. She was alone, sick, hanging around an abandoned parking lot at who knows what hour of the night. When did I become stupid? She gripped the rail with one sweaty hand and started up the stairs. Lori's body held out for all of 10 steps. Reaching the ground floor landing, she doubled over, one hand pressing against the glass door as she tried to suck in some deep breaths. The phlegm clogging her nose left her panting through her mouth. Okay, slower up the rest of the way. Straightening, a black mass filled the edge of her vision. She lurched back, the staircase railing clashing against her lower spine. The exterior floodlight drenched the small area outside the door, chasing back the shadows for a good few feet. Yet the dark figure remained. It was such a bottomless black that none of its details were visible. Instead, it was a silhouette, something approximate to a human shape. Even hunched over, it still stood taller than Lori, its arms pulled in tight against its body until the limbs blended into its torso. It was the fingers that drew her attention. The spindly digits grew as she watched them, extending for inches, their sharp tips twitching and flicking while its palms remained as still as stone. While it had no face, she knew that it was watching her, and she knew the moment that its gaze strayed. Without turning its head, its attention shifted to the keypad mounted beside the door. Slowly it lifted one twitching finger, the digit still growing, the tip sharpening into needles. A series of dull beeps filled the stairwell as it punched in a code. Her heart lurched into her throat as she waited, her hands shaking and sweat pooling against her palms. 4 beeps, then a few seconds of silence as the machine contemplated the numbers. The dull buzz weakened Laurie's knees. Incorrect code. Pressing a hand against her struggling lungs and rampaging heart, Laurie grappled for the handrail. The swamp of her brain made thinking a struggle. Instinct surged from the muck, and it screamed at her that she needed the glass door to remain in place. Whatever happened, she didn't want that thing to get any closer than it already was. A steady string of beeps shattered her thoughts. She spun around, ignoring the swirl of her brain and the sweat that stung her eyes. After a few steps, she had to grip the rail with both hands and drag herself up, her arms and legs both trembling with the strain. The sudden burst of activity let the illness flare. She could feel it taking hold of her weakening body as she forced herself to keep moving. Her heavy feet slipped over the tiles of the landing below her own. All she wanted to do was rest, but the series of beeps compelled her on. She felt the fourth tap like a spike in her chest, but she kept running as the machine silently contemplated its decision. The droning buzz turned her bones to liquid. Laurie's grip on the rail kept her from crashing hard against the staircase. It was a battle to get back up, but once she was moving again, she found that momentum was enough to keep her lumbering ever higher. Her progress was slower than it had been before. The beeps taunted her, mocking her as she struggled up the last few steps. Half slumped against the door, her sweat-slicked fingers fumbled with the keys. She worked it into the lock just as the last beep rolled up to meet her. Shoving her way through, she slammed the door shut before the machine made up its mind. The thick fire door muffled the decision, even as she pressed herself against it. Did it get in? Is it coming up? Straining her hearing to catch even just a trace of footsteps against stone was useless. All she could hear was her own blood rushing through her ears. Laurie? Whipping around to face her brother, she tried her best to hide her fear. Riley peeked around the corner leading into the hallway, his fingers gripping the plaster tightly, his eyes widening in the face of her forced smile. What are you doing out of bed? Her voice crackled as it worked through her burning throat. Are the doors locked? Yeah, of course. She rattled their front door to illustrate her point. He swallowed thickly before pushing himself a little further into view. Did they get in? They? Did you see something? Riley stretched one arm around the corner, his fingertips shaking slightly as he reached for her. Checking the balcony door was hardly discreet, given that she had to slip around the couch to get there, but she went as fast as she could so Riley wouldn't dwell on it. Rushing across the living room, she grabbed his clammy hand, letting him drag her past their parents' silent room. He had turned the nightlight off. If it weren't for the exterior glow that pierced the gap between the thick curtains, the room would have been entirely dark. Laurie smothered a cough while Riley dragged her around his bed and back to the window. The gap in the curtain was larger than it had been before, and she began to wonder if he had slept at all since she left him. Pausing with about a foot separating them from the window, Riley looked over his shoulder and pressed one of his small fingers to his lips. Keep quiet. She wasn't sure why noise would be much of a problem, but she nodded anyway and sunk onto her knees beside him. Together they leaned closer to the window and peeked through the gap. The material scratched at the tip of her nose as she glanced down at the driveway. Her breath caught. It's not the only one. You see them, don't you? Riley whispered. Laurie nodded, her eyes fixed on the shadowy figures identical to the one she had encountered. They shuffled along the narrow walkways that ran either side of the driveway. Some walked in groups of 3 or 4 as they casually strolled through the empty streets, but they all peeled off on their own eventually. Laurie craned her neck to follow one of them. Instead of keeping to the paths that led to the front doors, it chose to stand at the apartment's wall. She couldn't tear her eyes away as she watched the creature rear one hand up, the rest of its body remaining as rigid as a corpse. Its elongated fingers twitched as they grew, expanding out to effortlessly grip the corners of the large decorative bricks that covered the exterior. Then it began to climb. Its shoulders didn't move as it scaled the wall. Most of the motion came from its elbows to wrists, from its knees to its feet. Swiftly, silently, it moved up the side of the building. "What is it doing?" She whispered the thought aloud. Her answer came as the one she was tracking inched towards a glowing window and entered its light. Holding itself steady, it lifted one hand before the glass. Its fingertips twitched as they grew and thinned. The tiny needles wormed between the window pane and its mounting. Slowly it pushed the window open and crawled inside, disappearing into the darkness gathered within the still room. Holding her breath, Lori waited for a scream to pierce the night, for someone to notice the creatures invading their apartments, for lights to start flickering on and panic to take hold. Nothing happened. The night remained quiet and peaceful as, one by one, the monsters worked their way into the buildings. "Do you believe me now?" Riley whispered. "This is what you saw?" A crushing guilt rode on the heels of the thought. Why didn't I see it too? Why can't I now? Swallowing thickly, Lori snaked a hand through the gap between the curtains, her shaking fingers searching for the frame. A small jerk proved that it was locked. Suddenly, a deep shadow washed over them. The siblings scrambled back as the shapeless mass rose from the other side of the glass, smothering the exterior light and casting a deep shadow across the room. The hanging material allowed them only to see a slither of the creature, but it was enough to see the darkness split to expose white, needle-like fangs set in erratic rows. The smiling man. The thought ripped through her, spurring her into motion. Lori latched onto her brother's wrist, dragging him off his feet and into her arms. They sprinted around the bed as the smiling man tapped its elongated fingers against the glass. "Mom!" Lori's voice cracked violently, the pounding in her head growing until her vision blurred. "Dad!" Slow knocking resounded against the front door as they raced down the hallway. Lori kept Riley on her hip with one arm and reached for her parents' door with the other. For the space of 3 steps, upon crossing the threshold to the living room, she caught sight of the balcony door. Another smiling man stood there, its fingers twitching as it worked against the handle. "Mom!" She shoved the bedroom door open the second she had the doorknob nestled within her palm. The door flung open, rattling the wall as it smacked against it. A gentle breeze wafted through the open window to play with the curtains. The motion allowed the glow of the streetlight to bleed through from the outside. Superimposed upon the glow, the smiling man crouched over the motionless bodies upon the bed, its smile shining like a full moon. Instead of turning its head, the smiling man twisted from its torso to face them. Their mother dropped heavily onto the mattress as she slipped from its twitching fingers. Riley's scream cut through the night, the sound cracking and growing ragged as another smiling man crawled through the open window. Lori's head spun as the creatures melted into the shadows. Only their smiles were visible as they barreled towards the siblings. Spinning on her heel, Lori ran the few feet back down the hallway to the bathroom. "What are you doing?" Riley wailed. "Lori, we have to leave." Dropping him onto the bathroom floor, she swung the door shut, putting her shoulder against it while she fumbled with the lock. "Lori!" She shushed him. "There's one at the door. Just get in the shower.
Go!
The lock felt pathetically flimsy as it latched into place. Without a window, the room was pitch black, and Laurie couldn't bring herself to turn the lights on. Not knowing what else to do, Laurie left the door and stumbled her way across the tiny room. The glass of the shower stall was almost painfully cold against her fevered skin. Riley yelped when she pushed the swinging door inwards. "It's just me. It's okay," she whispered over and over. Why she bothered was beyond her. The smiling men knew exactly where they were. They began to gently test the doorknob as Laurie blindly worked herself onto the floor. The stall was narrow enough that, with her back pressed against the wall, she could wedge both feet against the door and keep it closed. Riley curled up beside her, his sweat dripping upon her. "Laurie?" "It's okay." She wrapped her arms around her little brother and drew him closer. "Just stay quiet. They don't break anything to get inside." She mentally clung to the theory. Surely if they were willing to break through glass and bust locks, their killings wouldn't go unnoticed. Instead, they wormed their way through open windows and unlocked doors. Open windows, open doors. Manic laughter welled in her chest, but fear kept it from slipping out as she thought how the apartment PIN code gave them that loophole. "Guess right, and it opens like an invitation." Nails tapped against the thin wood. The door handle jiggled. The metallic sound barely heard over the siblings' panted breaths. Hours crept by, and the tapping didn't stop. Her fevered brain struggled to separate the intense shadows from her memory of the smiling man's skin. As they cowered there, with the monsters waiting at the door, her mind played games on her. She could swear she saw the shadows part in her peripheral vision, but just as quickly as she caught a glimpse of fangs, it was gone. Adrenaline wasn't enough to keep the hours from grinding against her. Sunlight had begun to creep around the edges of the door as her legs trembled. Her fever continued to spike, making her sweat until her throat was dry and her eyes were rolling back in her head. There was no way to pinpoint when her exhaustion and illness claimed her. The tapping followed her down into unconsciousness, and she awoke to darkness and the warmth of Riley's urine cooling against her hip. "Sorry, Laurie," he whimpered. "I tried to hold it." "It's okay." Her throat was too parched to say much of anything more. It took her a second to realize that the daylight had faded once more. Her frazzled mind could barely grasp that they had spent the night locked in there, let alone an entire next day as well. The growl of her stomach and the pain radiating through her legs suggested that her fever had kept her out longer than that. But there was no way to tell for sure. Her feet hadn't slipped from their position against the glass door. She had Riley turn on the shower. The cool water diluted the urine on the floor. She tipped her head towards the flow, catching what droplets she could to soothe her parched throat. Her head pounded, but the pain wasn't close to what it had been before. At the very least, her fever had broken. "When did the tapping stop?" Laurie asked, after drinking what droplets she could. "I don't know. A while." "Have you heard them at all?" "No." She licked her lips. "Have you heard Mom and Dad?" "No." Her muscles protested as she reached over and pressed her hand against his forehead. "Your fever's broken, too." "I think I can make a run for it," Riley assured with no real conviction. Laurie let herself smile, hoping the relief would work its way into her voice. "The smiling man only goes after sick kids, remember? We're okay now. They'll go away, looking for another meal." "Laurie?" "Yeah?" The smiling man killed Mom and Dad. She swallowed painfully, torn between lying to reassure him and admitting what they both knew. So he doesn't just go after kids. They were sick too, she said. We're getting better, so they'll look for someone else. But what if they don't? What if you just have to be sick to see them? Then they'd still be there, waiting for us, and we'll never see them coming. Lori? Riley pressed in a whimper. What happens then?
Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.